second day of our seminar together. And I think after yesterday's discussion, we're well placed to continue with the papers today. We've got some really good papers coming up. I've got one addition to, a very happy addition to the program, which is that in the next session, Professor Rao will be presenting a paper in that session, which is entitled State Law and Torture, the Criminal Injustice System in India. That will, so I think what we can do is to accommodate that, we can make that a session that goes from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. And then we can have lunch from 1. It'll be a longer session. But the first session this morning, I'm delighted to have a session on gender and the critique of criminal justice. And we start with Dr. Ashley Tellis, who's going to talk on criminal justice as repression, why criminal law wars is the wrong route towards justice for sexual minorities.
So before I start, I wanted to thank Professor Bajpai for inviting me to this conference. I'm not a law person, and so it's exciting that one is called to a law institute when one is not a law person. I also want to thank Professor B.V. Pandey, who also recommended me, and Latika, who organized a conference last year on criminal law, sex and death in criminal law, where I presented versions in some sense of what I'm also going to do today. So, to start right away, the articulation of the rights of, and this is, I'm going to read just the first 1 or 2 pages, and then try and do the cases actually through point form so that we can save time and leave more time for discussion, and then read maybe the last few pages of my conclusion so that I try and finish within 20 minutes. But I want to read these first 2 pages and somewhat slowly because I want these first 2 pages contain really the crux of my argument. And I want that to be clear because it's a somewhat complicated, somewhat multi-layered argument. The articulation of the rights of sexual minorities through the law in India has involved repression at many levels. First, it has repressed the history of its own emergence at a particular historical moment, which is that of neoliberalism. And Ratna Kapoor made this point. Yesterday about how we have to understand the question of carceral feminism in her case in the context of the neoliberal movement. And that's what I'm saying right now about LGBT too. That the whole idea of LGBT as a movement really emerges in neoliberal India, in liberalization India in the 90s. And there's a reason for that, and there's also a series of effects of that, which I'll be talking about right through the paper. Second, it has repressed its own class, caste, and gender locations, erasing the complexities of same-sex cultures in India in favor of a sanitized and homogenized construction of sexual minorities as pure victims based on a behalfist politics or pure liberatory subjects awaiting liberation. And here clearly my critique is of Nas, which I will come to in a moment, of the Nas judgment. Third, and most importantly, it has repressed at its own cost law's relationship to the social, constructing law as an abstract and rarefied realm above the social, which can miraculously redeem those victims or purely liberatory subjects. And that's again linked to Ratna's point yesterday, and I'm happy that she's not here, but linked to Ratna's point yesterday about why do we go to the law first, and what does it mean when we go to the law first. Fourth, it has repressed the histories of struggles by various marginalized groups in constructing the legal as the motor of change, leaving the structural hegemonies of class, caste, and gender untouched, which is linked to the same point, which is point 3, which is that you can't change the social through law. You have to work with the two in tandem. And finally, my last point, it has repressed the othering immanent to criminal law by forcing the sexual minority subject into the criminal frame. So I'm talking about the criminalizing. The moment of emergence of the same-sex subject is a criminalizing moment, othering its voice with its own as that of the savior, that is law's voice as a savior, rendering it unable to articulate itself as a law-making subject. So the queer subject, or the LGBT subject, I don't like the word queer, which you'll know why in a moment, is not a law-making subject in India, it is a criminalized subject. In this paper, I hope to unpack these repressions and examine their sources, assumptions, and effects. I do this unpacking in favor of a twin project of working towards an agential, law-making sexual minority subject and a criminal law in touch with its own unconscious. Indeed, I argue that criminal law need not have the repression of its own unconscious, which is the social unconscious, as immanent to its structure, but in fact needs to expand its domain by engaging with its own repression of that unconscious. That engagement will produce a thicker, deeper, fuller account of both the law and the social. I am not among the people who argue that the law has no unconscious and can never have an unconscious. That it is fundamentally oppressive and merely an instrument with which to poke or not poke the social. I'm not an innovative man in effect. I don't think that the law is useless. I don't think the law is that something we don't need. I'm back to Spivak's point, which Ratna reiterated somewhat differently yesterday, which is the law is that which we cannot not want. You begin with the law. You have to engage with the law, is my point. Instead, I argue that law's unconscious is the social, and we have to tap into that unconscious to make it more powerful, just as in psychoanalysis, we tap into our unconscious to become more aware. Thus, the immanence I spoke about at the start in criminal law is not immanent to criminal law per se, but only to criminal law in its present form. And I want to talk a little about psychoanalysis before I proceed to Naz, which is that I want to explain to you where I come from in psychoanalysis and why psychoanalysis, which has been talked about from the very start with Professor Norrie opening the conference, is something that we need to understand historically. So my understanding of psychoanalysis really comes from the British. I'm trained in Britain, my PhD was in Britain, and I do think that the most profound and brilliant psychoanalytic engagements with the law, with social, with political issues, a materialist psychoanalysis has only come from Britain. And I'm familiar with at least 3 traditions. I'm also trained in the US as a postdoc, and I think American psychology and psychoanalysis is absolute rubbish. And also with the French tradition, and I read French, and I think that the French tradition of psychoanalysis is another kind of rubbish. So for me, the really only interesting people working with psychoanalysis are the British, I'm afraid. And for me, the British engagement has been largely, with women and not men at all, partly because I don't find the men really exciting in how they've engaged with psychoanalysis. So my engagement is with people like Juliet Mitchell, whom I spoke about yesterday, Jacqueline Rose, with an extraordinary journal in the 1970s that the British had called MF, Masculine Feminine, which came from feminist psychoanalysts like Parveen Adams, Elizabeth Cowie, a whole bunch of extraordinary British feminists who engaged with psychoanalysis. And this is my critique of Professor Alan Norrie and his colleagues, that in fact they don't engage with these women at all. These are British men who don't engage with their own women. And also the extraordinary Gillian Rose, whom I end this paper with, actually a colleague of Professor Alan Norrie at Warwick, an extraordinary figure who has been completely neglected by both psychoanalysts and philosophers and legal theorists, when in fact she wrote one of the most extraordinary books, I think, in the 20th century on law, philosophy, ethics, love, and that is Gillian Rose, the sister of Jacqueline Rose. And then latterly, I also want to acknowledge my debt to someone like Alan Norrie, whom I feel I've read with great benefit, partly because I don't understand why legal theorists don't engage with psychoanalysis at all, and at least Alan Norrie has begun that process. So latterly and belatedly, also Alan Norrie. Let's start with Naz. So with Naz, I don't want to read the whole section of Naz. It's a long section, and it's a section that takes too much time. So I will just go through the points quickly. It's a critique that I've made ever since the judgment happened, but it's a critique that has had no voice, actually. We've only had mindless celebrations of Naz from everywhere in the world, including otherwise rather intelligent men like Upendra Bakshi, who also has stood by Naz somewhat uncritically and unthinkingly, in my opinion. So we have had nothing but a celebration of Naz as the most amazing judgment around, which it is not. I'm arguing that Naz is one of the worst judgments to have happened in contemporary legal history, and I will explain why. So my first point is that you have to understand the whole unarticulated class, caste and gender dimensions of the Naz judgment and of the queer movement as a whole. This is a movement, as I've told you, that starts in the neoliberal moment. It starts as an NGOized movement. It starts, and I don't even want to call it a movement, because a movement is something which has a social base, which starts on the ground. The LGBT movement was airlifted from the US, literally, and dropped in these parts. In fact, one of the great jokes about the NFIW, the women's organization of the CPI, saying that Bill Clinton bought AIDS with a suitcase when he came to India in 1994. It's quite an extraordinary account of how AIDS came to India. But certainly that's how the queer movement came to India. And it emerges in that moment in a certain class, necessarily because the NGOized class is a certain class. It is not a class on the ground. The Nas judgment is mindlessly supported, but actually I feel that it could have been critiqued in many different ways, and it could have been critiqued, and it could have been a much stronger judgment had it engaged with a whole bunch of other judgments. And then, given that this is a workshop, I want to actually talk about one only. I can't talk about all it. It's in the paper, you can read it. But I wanted to talk about one group that it could have engaged with, and I want to do it via Mrinal's paper yesterday, which I had a strong critique of. And that is the child rights movement. And it seems to me that the child rights movement was one of the movements that opposed Nas judgment, and I feel that it could have been productively engaged with the Nas judgment in a way that would have actually made it a far more powerful movement. And so, for example, Mrinal's reading of POCSO as simply another law that the preventive state has created to suppress us is for me an extremely limited reading of POCSO. I think POCSO is an extremely complicated judgment. You have an appellate court judgment, for example, which tells you where the judge at an appellate court level is saying that POCSO is a highly problematic judgment. This is a case in Bengal of a young boy and a girl who ran away and of course came abducted, charges, habeas corpus, whatever, the standard stuff that goes on. And this judge in an appellate court is saying the state has no right over our bodies. POCSO is fundamentally an unconstitutional law. And so therefore you have a rift from within the law on POCSO, which Mrinal could have used far more productively than to make the banal observation that it is something that nothing but a preventive law that is symptomatic of the new Andrew Ashworth preventive state. So things like that could have been far more useful in the using of. The second big critique that I have of Nas is a colonial judgment. It's all about the march towards modernity. What is the basic point of Nas? We are, and this is back to Amit Binder's paper yesterday, where he brilliantly showed how in the death penalty arguments, in the civilizational thesis, we are the uncivilized barbarian nations. The white guys are the amazing guys who know everything about death penalty. Same with sexuality. Those are the guys who are all LGBT already and totally cool. We have to catch up. Literally, the term is catch up. We have to catch up with modernity. That is Nas's deeply colonial and repulsive logic in that judgment, all 125 pages of it. Then, the next point, and ironically enough, by the way, I want to quickly add, ironically, all the judgments it cites, while making the point that we should catch up, all the arguments it's making also is about how we don't have to follow the West at all. Our understanding of sexuality is different. We have always been LGBT. We have always been amazing. So make up your mind. And then again, all Western judgments to show how we should catch up. So I'm very confused by the Nas logic. The Nas, I think Muralidharan is one of the most confused judges I find in the history of modern legal India. But anyway, we'll go there on another day. We have a plethora of Muralidharan judgments. In fact, I feel like when I was teaching English in a law school, I wanted a series of judgments ranging from V. Krishna Iyer to Markandeya Kaju to show how to not write a judgment, how badly to write judgments. We need a book on Muralidharan to show how progressive judgments are deeply regressive actually. But we'll do those books later. For the moment, I want to make the next point about Nas, which is the point of class. That Nas is a class-based judgment. It is a judgment only, and not just class, it's about men. Women are mentioned twice in Nas in 125 pages. One is the wife of a Koti, and one is some unnamed invisible lesbian. Women don't exist for Nas. And this is why I think Kaushal is a much better judgment. Women at least exist in Kaushal. And a world without women is truly frightening in my opinion. But anyway, NGOization, I've already made the point. They use NACO as an ally, which I find very strange. NACO, there's no real difference between NACO and George Bush. Both of them are all about abstinence. Both of them are all about how you shouldn't have sex at all till your marriage. Both of them are deeply conservative. And here is this great progressive judgment marching towards modernity, saying NACO ko bhi saath leke chalte hain because let's do whatever we can. This is called legal strategism, I guess, but it makes no sense. Then of course it sets up the beautiful highfalutin language of public versus constitutional morality. I don't need to talk about constitutional morality because it doesn't exist largely. There are wonderful critiques that have come up within the field of jurisprudence itself, like Pritam Barua's fantastic essay on logic and coherence in Nas, which shows that there is no logic or coherence in the judgment on its own terms. But there are other critiques of the judgment also, which I don't know why Professor Upendra Bakshi has not read. But anyway, we come down to the question of the question of privacy, which I feel that privacy, again, no one has actually questioned this idea of privacy. Usha Ramanathan is using it so beautifully in Aadhaar, extremely problematically. Privacy does not exist outside class and caste boundaries. In fact, the whole question of Nas, first of all, Nas didn't decriminalize homosexuality at all. It simply read it down to say that people in their private bedrooms of the same sex can have sex. But they were having sex anyway.
You have a bedroom, you have sex behind the doors, who's going to arrest you? Why did we need this profound judgment that is changing human civilization to tell us that we can have sex in the bedroom? We need a law for hijras who have to have sex on the road, who have to have sex with the police because they are beaten up, and Nas doesn't cover them at all. Then there's no, as I said, there's no women, so there's certainly no lesbian in the last judgment at all. And I think again, what we are missing from our accounts day to day, even in yesterday's conference, is a question of legal ethnography. Please do some legal ethnography and see on the ground what this judgment means. I'll give you a small anecdote from my fieldwork. I was in Kerala at the time of the last judgment, and I was walking around with a Kerala lesbian activist, the greatest, most prominent activist who ran a group called Sahayatrika in Kerala at that point, and that was the most famous group. She's a Canadian Malayali lesbian. So we are walking, and she of course loves the judgment. She thinks it's changing her life, and she woke up in the morning dancing and singing, "Ki wah, kya judgment hai?" And we're walking on the roads, and I'm telling her this is a bakwas judgment. And we're walking, and then we meet lesbians, okay, like working class Mallu lesbians. We meet them on the road, and the prominent activist is telling them, "Oh my God, did you read the papers? 377 has now gone." And they're like, "What is 377? And so she then explains to them in her very broken Canadian Malayalam, she explains to them what is 377, and they're like, "How does it matter? Doesn't change our life in any way. Are we getting any concrete benefits? Is it changing our life in any way? Sorry, bye." And they walked out. And I was vindicated, and I felt delighted and happy. And the activist was so terrified, she left the last judgment on the steps of the road that we were walking on. So that was beautiful for me. So my point is that the last judgment, which is claiming to be this most extraordinary judgment that has changed the world, actually changes nothing. And I want to read the last 1 or 2 pages of my last section before I go on to caution. So, this is page 10 for those of you who have the copy before you, which is, does the reading down of section 377 to now make private adult consensual sex between any two people legal make any difference to anyone then but the privileged gay man? The NGO lobby has got private consensual sex exempted from section 377 and we are supposed to celebrate. But who is this we? Urban gay boys? Yes. Urban gay girls? Maybe. MSM, only the ones, MSM is the NGO terminology for men who have sex with men. It's an epidemiological category, not an identity, but never mind. Only the ones with urban NGOs. What difference does it make to a Dalit woman in Thrissur, the woman I engage with in my fieldwork, struggling to be with her female partner against pressure from both their families, her conformity-inducing workplace, both are also CPM party members and cannot talk about their relationship, the mocking community and the fascist state? What difference does it make to the transgender male-identified woman in Kottayam and his Dalit woman partner? The judgment talks about the inclusivist nature of the constitution, yet does not include several figures like the ones above who come within the same-sex rubric, let alone allies. What difference does it make to a heterosexual female sex worker who may be HIV positive? To the single economically poor mother whose child might be HIV positive? To the single woman per se? These are not rhetorical questions. The case could have been built and argued in such a way that all these figures, the hijra, whom I just spoke about on the ring road in Delhi, the same-sex loving woman, usually lower caste, Adivasi, rural, the sex worker, male, female or hijra, the trans woman and their lives would be part of the argument, would be made to matter. We may have lost the case, but it would be a struggle that was worth it. We could continue fighting. We could do what the judgment cites Ambedkar as calling for, building a true constitutional morality. Instead, what was effected was the subsumption of all complexities, all productive antagonisms into the unifying queer subject, validating itself through law. This amounts, I argue, not only to a violation of the communities marginalized by this judgment, but also of the law. The personal autonomy of the same-sex subject is ensured in the constitutional sense, we are told, but what does that concretely mean? Who and where is this figure who inhabits the realm of pure constitutionalism, where there is no religion and no morality, no community and no multiple axes of disenfranchisement? There are enough articles already in the constitution that would notionally ensure this figure its rights, a bit like the B.B. Pandey and Ratna Kapoor point yesterday about why did we need the amendments of 2013, the laws were fine. But where is this figure in India? Have these articles in the constitution prevented the atrocities Dalits, Adivasis, women or religious minorities have faced and continue to face in the history of India since the formation of the constitution? These communities are not even out there, separate from us. Many of us LGBT people are Dalit, are religious minorities, and both, are disabled and also same-sex desiring. Can we bask in the glory of this constitutional refining of our personal autonomy? Repealing and just not beating down 377 need not have necessarily been just the symbolic victory it might have been, constitutional, empty, and based on the idea of personal autonomy that has hidden caste, class, and gender positions. It could have been made a really powerful movement, and even more had the battle been fought hand in hand with all other groups. And I'll stop there, you can read the rest on your own. Moving to caution. Caution is considered the most disgusting judgment around, whereas I think it's actually a brilliant judgment. Kaushal, first of all, is a legal judgment. It actually follows the law, and it actually opens up in a way that this is what I'm trying to say about opening the legal unconscious from within the law. It allows us the space to open up many things which Nas, in its smug superiority, just does not allow us. And Kaushal is amazing for doing that. Let's see how. The Kaushal judgment of the Supreme Court of India, which undid the Nas judgment, was unanimously excoriated by the so-called queer movement, the left liberals, and practically everyone else. It was seen as a deeply regressive judgment that undid the brilliant and amazing Nas judgment, and it was mourned in dramatic fashion along the length and breadth of the country, just as the Nas judgment was celebrated mindlessly across the country. It was damned as a judgment without any engagement with the possibilities it opens up. Indeed, it is a far better and more useful judgment than the Nas, in that it shows up the false arguments and logic of Nas, and what it does raise are important questions about the use of law in the battle for rights around sexuality. Indeed, I argue that Nas is what Robert Coburn would call a jurispacific judgment, producing pathology, as I have shown, and Kaushal is what he would call a juris-generative judgment. What Kaushal did was to call the bluff of Nas on its own terms, a bit like I'm told Professor Upendra Bakshi called the bluff on Khanna some years ago, but I don't know enough about that judgment. Perhaps Professor Bakshi will tell us about it later. But broadly again, the Kaushal judgment is basically saying this, that basically what it does is, and I give you an example of this one case which I talk about briefly on page 16 for those of you who have the essay, which is State of Kerala versus Kusumkara Govindan. In this case, there is a lengthy and positively absurd discussion of whether placing a penis between the thighs of a woman is against the order of nature, and the conclusion of that Kaushal comes to is that yes, it is, and that putting a penis in the mouth, which makes oral intercourse also illegal, is against the order of nature. Such is our very sad sex lives in India, clearly. There is a lot that can be done with this judgment, in my opinion, because it opens up precisely what Nas shuts down, and that's what we need to do. I have only 5 minutes left, so I can't go through the Nalsa judgment, which is my longest section again. But we can talk about it in discussion. My Nalsa point is, again, to summarize the 25 points I made in that section into one point. Basically, what Nalsa is saying, I'm arguing, is that it produces the transgender, and this comes back to Professor Upendra Bakshi's point yesterday and also Professor B.V. Pandey's point yesterday about how the language and the very framing of how we understand categories here seems to come from the West without even thinking. So transgender, which is largely a US term, is what is grafted into the Nalsa judgment without even any contextualization. And I counterpose this entirely Americanized language of transgender identity politics into actually the ground realities of Hijraz on the ground in India, which is a far more complicated reality that actually, again, calls the bluff on Nalsa as an extremely problematic judgment. So, to conclude, what I want to basically say is, what I've tried to show in this paper is that through a dense fleshing out of what I'm calling the repressed unconscious of the law, crucially from within the realm of law, one can complicate the idea of law and how law might regulate sexuality. It rather shows how sexuality might regulate the law and lead to what Cover thinks law should facilitate: openness and normative plurality. While Cover's own liberal politics does not allow him to develop that plurality in a radical way, I counterpose Cover to Gillian Rose. And I can't, again, I don't have the time, I have 5 minutes left, but I wanted to tell you about Gillian Rose's extraordinary work, particularly in the book Mourning Becomes the Law, where she offers both, and this in some sense comes back to both Professor Upendra Bakshi's and Professor B.V. Pandey's preternatural dislike for theory, part of which I share and part of which I don't share. As a younger generation person who has taught in Delhi University for more than 15 years, I have fought lots of these dinosaurs who hate theory and who hate political philosophy, but we are in a critical theory workshop, and I think that we have to really learn to historicize theory, and Gillian Rose does it brilliantly. Actually, both Professor Bakshi and Professor B.V. Pandey would be happy with Gillian Rose, because she offers a critique of postmodernism that is coming back to Professor Alan Norrie's point, which I want to end on the question of metaphysics and love. And I think these are the two most important ideas, except that I, unlike Professor Alan Norrie and his colleagues, would certainly not go to Roy Unreadable Bhaskar for them. I would rather go to Gillian Rose for them, because I feel that she understands both the question of the metaphysics, which I'm very glad Alan Norrie has come back to, because I think, and that's Gillian Rose's main critique in the book, that we have, when we lose the question of metaphysics in the question of ethics, then we lose everything. So the point of metaphysics, I'm very glad Professor Alan Norrie is coming back to, except that I wouldn't come back to it in the same way that he does, not via Roy Bhaskar at all, but via Gillian Rose. And the second point about love, where again, certainly Professor Alan Norrie and I do not share the same idea of love, because my idea of love again comes from Rose, and from Rose's critique of Derrida, actually, which Amit Bindal did not actually engage with at all, and should perhaps in his later developments of the paper. And that idea of love and the metaphysics has nothing to do with the spiritual, has nothing to do with religious, but to do with the ethical that actually engages with the deepest questions that have come from Western philosophy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we move on to Rafta Chowdhury, whose topic is Upholding Law and Horizontal Radical Change.
Thank you, Professor Modi. And I need to thank you because I sent my abstract to you. So that's the reason I sit here today. And like Ashley, I'm going to talk about another criminalized subject of law, and I'll be focusing upon judicial construction and treatment of the prostitute or the sex workers. These are the terms interchangeably used in the judgment, so I'm evoking those terms, and of course fully aware of the politics behind the usage of both of these. And this I would do through select judgments only, pronounced by the Supreme Court during the last 50 years. And to begin with, I've taken one judgment from each decade, starting from the 60s onwards, but it's part of a larger project in which I'll take more cases. And the larger time frame has facilitated a mapping of the discursive shift that can be read from the judgment, including the use of the term prostitute till the 1990s to the sex work. And this is, I found the term sex work in only 2011 judgment. One wonders if this shift is symbolic of change or a repackaging of the regulatory framework followed in India vis-a-vis prostitution. That remains to be seen. I've also briefly taken up an analysis of the bar dancers case, even though it's not explicitly focused around about questions of prostitution, but implicitly it deals with those questions. And one is not, in between, this is because I need to clarify the fact that the version that you have in the booklet is slightly different from this. The political theorist in me has attempted to do a reading of the fraught, seemingly at least, a relationship between the executive and the legislature, which I'll skip in this particular presentation. And the state is not being seen here as a monolith, but a set of institutions, units, practices. And the legal domain opens up as a crucial site of producing modernist nationalist masculinity as public spirited lawyers and predominantly male judges rescue these fallen women or their children, depending upon the case in question. And all this while androcentricity, eccentricity, misogyny, paternalism, and sexism inherent in the law remains intact, which would be clear through the judgments that I'll take up. The prostitute in that sense is both the effect of discursive power and what McLean and Australian feminist criminologists calls the elements of its articulation. Law thus simultaneously emerges as an instrument of social transformation, also a tool of social control, by creating a culture of muting marginal voices. In addition, it also performs the function of rhetoric, thus rendering itself redundant, as Ashwini Tambe points out. And the initial sections of the paper focus upon a thematic analysis of the judgments, and the last section highlights the need to incorporate feminist perspectives to rethink the hegemonic heteronormative notions of sex, consent, agency, choice, work, desire, chastity, and motherhood. Now, the judges in these judgments, they seem to have perfected ambivalence about the legal subject in question, and much has been written about and around the notion of victimization, the predominance of rescue and rehabilitation strategies as a response on part of the state and non-state actors to questions of agency, choice, in both mainstream and critical discourses. But my focus in this paper is to critically look at the language in which these expendable bodies are being described to both produce as well as affirm their victimhood, and thus justifying state intervention. And by using terms like fallen victims, unfortunate fallen women, unwilling participants, and involuntary victims of compelled circumstances, the judges are very well able to achieve that. This ambivalence is evident in a 1975 judgment, Chintinde Vaswani, where the judge described the men found in a bar as willing male victims who were being seduced by the girls soliciting carnal custom flit. And these male victims were alternately described as takers of virginity who sip every flower and change every hour. The ideas about loose women date back to earliest ideas in mainstream criminology, wherein female offenders, including prostitutes, were treated as biological throwbacks. And the implication being that prostitutes were considered to be oversexed and shameless, and hence the males are victims of the temptress, like the males in this particular judgment. The judge wrote, not for dramatic effect, but to sting social conscience, we set out the tragic story of this case, and the manner in which he goes on to describe the scene in the bar during the time of the raid is far from being tragic, and the seemingly well-meaning judge ends up objectifying the women assumed to be prostitutes by further denying them dignity. The adjectives used to describe the bodies of these girls and women found in the bar, like luscious figure, flower, young flesh, scantily clad female flesh of sweet 17, are almost titillating. Kalsam rightly points out, in the legal text, the evidence, the voice is exclusively male and the body is female. And this is Justice Krishna here. And one can imagine, in this gathering at least, one need not mention his contribution to jurisprudence. And this is the best of our men. So we can imagine what the rest would be like. It is a difficult domain, as the figure of the prostitute challenges the binary of offender and victim, collapsing both into a single entity. And there seems to be this organic link between depravity, between poverty and moral depravity. Like in Vishalji, it was pointed out that many unfortunate girls in full bloom were being sold in various parts of the country, even by their parents, due to acute poverty and unbearable miseries, also in the hope that their children would be engaged only in household duties or manual labor. Now here the family is being exonerated from the charges of pushing their own child into prostitution. By redefining need as poverty, this sort of helps in normalization of the dependent by the lawyers, since need happens to be a subjective category and not a valid ground for lenience, while poverty is a social category over which the individual had no control. So these families were helpless families. The blame is then shifted onto the pimps, brothel keepers and brokers of flesh trade who entice the girls or kidnap them. The trafficking is cited as a major reason forcing unsuspecting women and girls to enter prostitution. Other than the fact that there are multiple reasons, this understanding of all trafficking as leading to sexual exploitation is problematic, as theoretically it leads to this sort of reification of gender stereotypes about women's purity and helplessness, and also the practical aspect of such conflation leads to invisibilizing those trafficked for other purposes and hampers developing a perspective for sex workers' rights. These judgments, as I pointed out earlier, in that sense establish moral depravity as almost compulsory adjunct of poverty, and which also facilitates the grounds on which the judges take on the role of moral crusaders. A distinction between, I'm skipping the description because of paucity of time, so a distinction between the conscious self and the body as a commodity is being made in a Cartesian vein. When terms like submitting bodies, flesh trade are used, this dualism gets reiterated and reinforced. It is also stigmatizing old age sex, as the sexagenarian with a plastic smile seems to be the epitome of torture inflicted upon these young bodies. As far as the micropolitics of zoning is concerned, this judgment is also about marking space that is available and not available to certain people, behaviors, identities, choice and activities. Like in Chintan Vaswani itself, the provision about prostitution taking place within the so-called offending distance of 200 yards were interpreted quite liberally. And the reason why the judge did a liberal interpretation, he claimed, was to ensure moral hygiene in the locality, and it was almost equivalent to moral scavenging operation or a fumigation process. Justice Krishna here, obviously. A clear binary of rich oppressors and poor victims is reiterated in successive judgments. Trafficking and prostitution as phenomena are much more complex than these simple renderings. In other cases also, the judges lamented what was once restricted to certain areas of human habitation has now spread into several localities. A lot of planning goes into defining, constructing and maintaining urban spaces, as bodies and desires are distributed in specific ways to maintain the binary of licit and illicit, and moral regulation of public spaces has been in the core of the sort of prostitution laws that we have had, which prohibit soliciting. That is how the speciality of sexuality is maintained. Now, in other judgments, the anxiety to reproduce the nation is evident, Like in Gaurav Chen, the judges were to respond to a PIL asking for direction in case of children of prostitutes being removed from brothels and put to separate educational institutions. The law here makes a distinction between promiscuous mother and the non-promiscuous mother, and the children are to be protected against the non-promiscuous mother. The focus of the court was on young girls whose mind and body are likely to be abused with growing age for being admitted into the profession of their mothers. This assumption of only women and girls having bodies that can be raped or prostituted is a dangerous oversight, as all bodies are rapeable. Just as an aside, my father at this tender age of 72, this was 2 years back, he faced Adam teasing for the first time in his life near the metro station in Delhi University. So we still live by the assumption that only women and girls can be raped or abused sexually. Now, from the definition of a prostitute as a woman offering herself promiscuously under the old act to the use of the term persons in the present one, the effect of law has barely changed. The premium placed on children as future wealth and citizens of the nation is evident. Latika yesterday problematized this universal category of the child marked with purity and asexuality as the hallmark. The judges cited various provisions of the Juvenile Justice Act which were relevant for taking care of the needs and rights of these neglected juveniles as defined in the judgment. Of course, now we call them children in conflict with law. We have been sensitized and the category of the juvenile has been sanitized. The emphasis on using the 3 C's, that is counseling, cajoling, coercion to educate and rehabilitate these children, was emphasized. The prostitute as the marked subject of law is time and again infantilized by taking away her power to take decision even in personal matters. The exploitation of women in the name of customs of Devasis, Yogins and Venkatans was decried by the court. It was also pointed out that most of them belong to either the scheduled castes or scheduled categories or OBCs groups. This was reported as a matter of fact, and the need to make a connection between caste and these customary practices was hardly felt by the court. Our Kalpana Kannabirans, Janki Nair, Sharmila Rege, Sumanta Banerjee and others, they might keep producing illuminating work around these figures and practices, but our judges remain in doubt. One also wonders, do they fear the lights? Further, the court observed recent trends since that ladies from higher levels, this is worth listening, ladies from higher levels of income are initiated into the prostitution to sustain sufficient day-to-day luxurious style of life so as to ensure continuous economic support for their well-being. And in the same judgment, it is also an inevitable consequence that over the years, the fallen women are accustomed to certain lifestyle, and in terms of expenditure, they need certain amount of money for their upkeep and maintenance. Interestingly, these women are conveniently pictured as living in squalid conditions, as evident from the earlier judgment, and might also very well serve as the icon of neoliberal consumerism. And this is why Amita Dhanda cautions about the conferral of precedent value to role stereotypes in judgments, and the fact that there has to be cautious judicial endorsement of them. This construction of the prostitute as freely consenting and economically active subjects comes in handy in absolving the judges and the state of the responsibility to ensure their well-being. As far as desexualizing these very much sexual subjects is concerned, judges often cite from works of literature, cinema, poetry to strengthen their arguments. Like in Gaurav Chen, the judge started off by writing, "Felity, thy name is woman," was the ignominy heaped upon women of Victorian era by William Shakespeare in his great work Hamlet. The history or sociology has, however, established the contrary. "Fortitude, thy name is woman. Courage, thy name is woman. Self-sacrifice, thy name is woman. Tenacity and successful pursuit, thy name is woman." And they go on. Further, in the same judgment, Indira Gandhi, Margaret Thatcher, Srimao Bandanaike, Golda Meir, a few illustrious women who having proved successful in democratic governance of the respective democratic states. Now, while a plain reading of this particular portion from the judgment would appear to be an exercise in rhetoric, Resnick Helbron, they point out the subversive potential of these convergences of law and literature, as then one would be able to see, I quote, how each discipline incorporates these assumptions as men speak, judge, describe and ascribe, and how to challenge that shared vision of the social order. Amongst all these judgments, only one judgment had a female judge. Naming few successful women is also a strategy to stress that women too can lead an impressive life, since modern democratic societies, they treat them at par with men, and so the women who fail to take advantage are to be blamed for their sorry states rather than the society. In Buddhadev Karmaskara, this is the 2011 judgment that judges wrote. In the novels and stories of the great Bengali writer Sarath Chattopadhyay, many prostitutes have been shown to be women of very high character, like Rajya Lakshmi in Shrikant, Chandramukhi in Devdas. Further, they supported this rhetoric by pointing out the plight of prostitute being depicted in the poetry of famous Urdu poet and lyricist Sahil Ludhianvi, who was erroneously mentioned as Sahil Ludhianvi. Further, we may also refer to the characters Sonia Marmeladov in Dostoevsky's famous novel Crime and Punishment. Sonia is depicted as a girl who sacrifices her body to earn some bread for her impoverished family. The opening line in this judgment was, sex workers are also human beings. The additional category of also human beings is a way of asserting that I is being broadened to include the other as well. Since this case involves a sex worker who is brutally murdered in full public view, the sex worker is no longer a threat, and her inclusion in humanity will not rupture the moral or the social order. This is the only judgment, as I pointed out earlier, in which the term sex worker was used instead of prostitute. And death seemed to have purged the moral impurity of the deceased and to indeed restore her as a human being, despite being a sex worker. Alibis of prostitutes with strong characters were sought. By citing these old literary texts, I feel the sex worker gets established historically, as presenting her ahistorically somehow implicates the present regimes. The transnationality attached to such descriptions makes the narrative more authentic without mentioning the structural specificities of different cultures. The judges are also employing these literary alibis to ensure what Burrell calls reproduction of consensus, that is, building up a sort of commonsensical understanding of the prostitute. These women have gone against the givens of law as well as gender roles, and hence their femininity is to be proved rather than assumed, which can be done by mentioning such characters. There seems to be no private life for these public women, as the paternalistic state takes it upon itself to help these helpless and hapless victims by finding genuine bridegrooms to give them real status in society. These are the reasons given in the judgment. Or by taking the custody of their children, as prostitutes do not want to have children, and ordinarily when children are born to them, it is in spite of their desire not to rear children. So the prostitute is not only a reluctant mother, but is also an inefficient one. Simone de Beauvoir writes that a caste of shameless women allows the honest woman to be treated with the most chivalrous respect, and we did talk about the transferability of the whole stigma to all women yesterday. Now, muting has been used as a technology of control, that is throughout the judicial discourse, the way lawyers normalize the defendants and the way judges universalize and generalize about them and their lives. These prostitutes are still seen as threats in terms of health and morality, and are simultaneously being sexualized by objectifying them and desexualized by representing them as victims. Terms like swelled sylphs, scantily clad female flesh of sweet 17 or thereabouts, commercial sex as solicit carnal custom flit, promiscuous sex, unwilling participants and involuntary victims of compelled circumstances are indicative of the sexism and tokenism that has dominated legal language during the period covered through these judgments. The post-colonial sexual subaltern subject and pleasure, even I am missing that Nagapur, is nowhere in sight in these formulations. It is hard to locate the speaking and animated subject that some feminists and critical theorists have claimed to recuperate in the context of sex work and prostitution. In fact, the multiple subjectivities of these women are muted under the larger imagination of the victimization framework. And even though it is all about sex, sex itself is missing from these accounts, which is not to affirm Indian prudery, as the same judges, surprise us by eloquently pointing out the importance of sex in a married couple's life in cases around matrimonial disputes. There was one such case, Geeta Nejavan versus Balkrishna Jhamana. It's a 1973, quite dated judgment, and I was tempted to include a quote from there. This is a divorce case. So, I quote, "Marriage without sex is an anathema. Sex is the foundation of marriage, and without a vigorous and harmonious sexual activity, it would be impossible for any marriage to continue for long. It cannot be denied that the sexual activity in marriage has an extremely favorable influence on a woman's mind and body, the result being that if she does not get proper sexual satisfaction, it will lead to depression and frustration. It has been said that the sexual relations, when happy and harmonious, vivifies a woman's brain." So, if you think you're lacking in mental capacities, you know whom to blame. "It develops her character and trebles her vitality." There was a scale, it seems, they could measure it. "It must be recognized that nothing is more fatal to marriage than disappointment in sexual intercourse." And you don't find any mention of sexual act per se in these judgments. Now, coming back to our non-womanly or even non-humanly women, their bodies and lives are made more productive and conformist by sending them to corrective institutions or marrying them off or teaching them gendered vocational skills so that they do not fall back into the trap of sex work again. Rajeshwari, Sundarajan and others of our time might keep pointing out the flaws in these ideas of rehabilitation. They stay put as ultimate official solutions, and it seems the state is also outsourcing its surveillance responsibilities by putting these women, uncontrollable women, under charge of husbands or families or even NGOs. I'm going to skip some portions. And coming to the state of Maharashtra and another versus Indian Hotel and Restaurants Association, this is what is popularly known as the bar dancers case. Also, in this case, an appeal came up against an amendment. I think most of us would be familiar with the fact that dance in these low-end bars were banned, and of course, exempted category comprised of Gymkhana clubs and other elitist such places, 3-star and above hotels, etc. So the court questioned this. Some hope. The court questioned this differential treatment and was of the opinion that rather than imposing the ban, the state government and the legislature should have adopted measures to ensure the safety and improve the working conditions of the persons working as bar girls. And similar sort of an evocation had happened in Anushkar in the state. So the case is still subjudiced, with the court insisting on granting the bar dancers their right to livelihood, and the state government continues to sidestep the judicial orders by non-compliance, delaying the grant of licenses, harassing the bar owners, and even bringing in fresh legislation, a new law, to undo the effects of the court orders. Now I'll take up from Ashley here. Even though the court emerges as the champion of the bar dancers' right to livelihood within the framework of constitutional provisions, a closer look at the language of the judgment would help in understanding the conditional relief. We were talking about conditional forgiveness yesterday. It is a conditional relief in this context, since the court, and that is also contingent upon the fact that finally, if the court order gets implemented, the dance bars were seen by the court as better sites of work for semi-literate or literate girls who may be beautiful, knows to dance or tries to dance, prohibited from earning a better livelihood, or should such a girl, because of poverty and want of literacy, be condemned to a life of only doing menial jobs. So the court found that washing utensils and clothes is far more degrading than bar dancing, so let's give them this right. Menon alerts us to the dangers inherent in such reasoning as they reinforce sexualized images of women in the public sphere. In addition, the court is allowing a sanitized dancer only to return to the bar, so they are to be properly clothed, there would be railing around the dance floors, and they have to maintain a dignified distance from the clients, and the tips and all would be handed over to the men, the manager and others in charge of that place. Now one wonders whether feminism in this entire repackaging of justice, because if one looks at the arguments presented in this particular case, the bar dancers case, the terms of discourse seem to be changing discernibly, even though the dominant frame remains that of morality and obscenity. Catherine McKinnon's work has been evoked to argue in favor of the ban. The selective appropriation of a voice from feminist world lends credence to the pro-women stance of the lawyer and also sounds politically correct way of arguing in face of a remarkably visible sex workers movement. Sutherland, while analyzing the limitations of Mackina's conflation of women with commodity, points out that women's status as commodities rather than authors of those commodities ultimately forecloses the possibility of consciousness raising and of praxis. And rather than simply borrowing from Western feminist formulations around prostitution, we need to also look at the work done in Indian context specifically, and a substantial body of work exists. In fact, Gitanjali Ganguly has roughly tried to categorize the responses of women's movement, other feminists, to the prostitution question in 3 ways: silence, third one choice, and the third one by positing sex work as a choice, by using the term sex work. While the first two approaches seem the dominant approaches, they have validated and have been validated through feeding into and reflecting mainstream patriarchal views on prostitution. The third approach obviously has its own problems, even though it appears to be the preferred perspective. The terms of discourse are to be changed, and the change is possible by bringing in formulations by other feminists and critical theorists. And like I pointed out earlier, there is substantial body of work that exists. I don't want to refer to that literature. In fact, critical voices from both inside and outside the legal sphere, academia and social movements have been quite sharp and incisive, right from the days of the open letter to the contemporary times, but have failed to reach our judges and their judgment. It is then the combined burden of legal fraternity and critical scholars and activists to reiterate the critical readings in various forums, this forum being one such, so that they become a part of the discursive regimes that contribute to construction of the figure of the prostitute. Then only the displacement of the existing stereotypes or the hegemonic scripts is possible, which is essential for a more inclusive judicial system. Thank you.